Welcome to Cozy Vintage Studio. Tonight, you'll rest in the hush of a 1940s night where rain slides down narrow streets, jazz hums softly from a cafe radio, and a quiet story begins to breathe. It's the tale of Elias, a writer who once believed his words had lost their meaning until one rainy night, guided by music, a singer named Clara, and the gentle wisdom of a stranger, he learns what it truly means to begin again. As your mind slows, remember, rest isn't the absence of thought, it's the gentle turning of one page before the next. What if wisdom waits not in grand moments, but in the smallest corners of a cafe, or in the silence after a song ends? Tonight, you'll walk through that silence with Elias, from the rain-soaked doorway, to the candle-lit table, to the first light of morning. Breathe slowly, let the jazz carry you inward. A cup warms in his hands, the city fades outside, and the story begins. The city had been waiting all evening for the storm to begin. When the first drops finally came, they fell with that deliberate rhythm that sounded more like thought than weather. On the corner of Rue Marceau, beneath a flickering street lamp, Elias Monroe paused. His hat brim caught the rain. His suitcase darkened with each drop. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure whether to walk home or let the rain decide for him. Across the street, the glow of a small sign pulsed through the mist. Le Cygne Noir, a jazz cafe, half hidden by ivy and shadow. He had passed it before, but never gone inside. Tonight, though, something about the sound, a low saxophone line, drifting through the doorway, felt like an invitation. Elias crossed the street, his shoes catching puddles, his reflection breaking apart with each step. Inside, warmth and quiet collided. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and polished wood. The lights were soft, amber, forgiving. A few late patrons sat scattered among small round tables. Behind the counter, a young man polished glasses, his movements slow and practiced. The saxophone melted into a brush of cymbals, the rhythm steady and kind. Elias stood just inside the doorway, rainwater running from his coat. The hostess, a woman with her hair pinned high, gave a small nod toward an empty table near the window. "Sit wherever you like," she said. Her voice was gentle, as if the storm had taught her patience. He chose the corner seat by instinct, the one slightly apart from the rest, half in shadow, half in view. There he could watch without being seen. From his pocket, he pulled a notebook, its pages slightly damp, but he didn't open it. Instead, he let his gaze travel to the small stage near the back. The microphone stood idle, a single stool beside it. Someone was setting up a record player. The saxophonist leaned against the wall, waiting for the next song. Elias cupped his hands around the warm coffee the waiter had brought. It was bitter, but he welcomed the taste. It reminded him he was still here, still made of something human. For months he had wandered the city, trying to write again, trying to find words that meant something. The war had ended, but in his mind the noise hadn't stopped. Every story felt empty, every idea borrowed. So he walked, night after night, until the rain or exhaustion sent him indoors. Outside, the storm gathered strength. It drummed against the glass, weaving its own melody into the room's music. The people inside seemed to move slower because of it. Conversations lowered, laughter softened. Even the waiter's footsteps carried a kind of rhythm. Elias watched them, envying their ease. They seemed untouched by the weight that followed him. He turned his attention to the small stage again. The record ended. The brief silence before the next song felt enormous. In that quiet, Elias noticed a woman standing near the bar. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself with a calm certainty that drew the eye. Her dress was simple, dark, and her hair framed her face, like a question that didn't need an answer. She spoke to the saxophonist, who nodded and smiled. Then she stepped onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked toward the room with a soft, unguarded expression. No one introduced her. She didn't need it. When she began to sing, the cafe seemed to exhale. Her voice was low, shaped by experience more than technique. Each note carried the weight of something lived, something endured. She sang not for applause, but for memory. Elias felt it immediately, the quiet truth in her tone, the tenderness that asked nothing in return. He set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. The song's refrain lingered in his chest, long after it passed his ears. It was about distance, about the kind of silence that follows loss. He didn't recognize the melody, but it felt older than the rain outside. For the first time in months, Elias stopped thinking about himself. The song filled the empty spaces where worry had lived. Each line seemed to press gently against a bruise he had long ignored. When the music faded, the audience offered a polite ripple of applause. Clara, he would learn her name later, gave a small nod and stepped down from the stage. She spoke briefly to the man at the piano, then moved toward the counter. Elias watched her without meaning to, noticing how she paused to listen when someone spoke, how she smiled as if the smile belonged to the moment, rather than to her. The door opened briefly. Wind and rain spilled in, scattering the candle flames. A tall man in a long coat entered, shaking off the storm. His hair was silver, his posture straight but unhurried. He nodded to the hostess, hung his coat, and scanned the room. When his gaze found Elias, he smiled, an old, knowing smile, and made his way over. "May I?" the man asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Elias hesitated, then nodded. The man sat, placing a worn leather notebook on the table. "Quite the night," he said. "Rain has a way of making us remember things we tried to forget." Elias wasn't sure how to respond. He managed a small smile. "I suppose it does." The man extended a hand. "Beaumont," he said. "You look like someone who listens." Elias shook his hand, unsure whether to feel flattered or seen. "Elias," he replied. They sat for a while, in companionable silence. Beaumont ordered bourbon. Elias, another coffee. The music resumed. Slower now, almost reflective. Finally Beaumont spoke again. "Do you ever find that stories lose their meaning when you most need them?" Elias looked up, startled. "Often," he said. Beaumont chuckled softly. "Then perhaps the story is waiting for you to change before it can make sense." The words lingered like the echo of a distant chord. Elias studied the man's lined face, the calm behind his eyes. There was something unsettling in his certainty, something that suggested he wasn't speaking in metaphor. Outside, lightning flickered through the rain, illuminating the window pane. Elias glanced at his reflection in the glass, half lit, half shadowed, like the life he'd been living. Beaumont leaned back. "Stay a while," he said. "The night's only begun, and sometimes, when the world slows down like this, a story will find its way to the surface." Elias wanted to dismiss the comment, to say he didn't believe in that sort of thing anymore. But the rain was steady, the music kind, and for once he felt no need to argue with the quiet. He nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell me one then." Beaumont smiled, the kind of smile that comes from someone who's already been waiting to be asked. And as the cafe lights dimmed and the first bars of a new tune began, Elias didn't realize that the story Beaumont was about to tell would mirror his own. Outside, the storm softened, but the night was far from over. The night had settled into its rhythm. Outside, the rain had become steady and forgiving, no longer violent, just present, like an old thought that refused to fade. Inside Lee Sing-Noir, the lamps glowed softer now, their amber light trembling over glass and smoke. Elias sat in his corner, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Across from him, Mr. Beaumont sipped his bourbon as though it were memory itself. The cafe felt suspended between songs, that brief stillness when sound and silence share the same breath. Elias had always loved those moments, the pauses that let meaning rise to the surface. He just hadn't known how to listen for them lately. "You're right," Beaumont said suddenly, though Elias hadn't mentioned it. "I used to," Elias replied. His voice was low, half an apology, half confession. "Now I just carry the notebooks around, like relics. Easier than admitting they're empty." Beaumont smiled gently, the corners of his eyes folding like paper. "Ah, empty pages are never empty, my friend. They're only waiting for someone brave enough to see what's still missing." Elias glanced toward the stage. The band was adjusting again. Clara stood near the piano, tuning her breath, humming softly. There was something about the way she prepared to sing, a reverence, not for performance, but for the act itself. He wondered if she too carried silence, like a wound she could only soothe through sound. "You come here often?" Beaumont asked, following his gaze. "No," Elias said. "I usually walk until the streets forget me." Beaumont nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Then tonight the streets must have wanted to remember you instead." Elias laughed once, quietly. "You talk like a man who reads too much poetry, only the kind written by rain," Beaumont said. He raised his glass slightly, a toast to nothing in particular, but let's speak honestly. You didn't come here only to escape the weather. The words caught Elias off guard. He looked at the man, unsure whether to deny or admit it. "I didn't know I was coming here until I did," he said finally. Beaumont studied him, his expression thoughtful but kind. "Then that's how all good journeys begin, by accident." The band began to play again. This time it was a slower tune, something intimate, made of brushed drums and muted trumpet. Clara stepped forward and began to sing. Her voice filled the cafe again, not louder, just deeper, carrying something raw beneath the smooth surface of melody. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Her tone moved like smoke, curling around each listener, binding them to the moment. He could hear the ache in it, the quiet defiance of someone who had chosen tenderness despite the world's insistence on hardness. Beaumont watched him carefully. "She sings the way you used to write," he murmured. Elias frowned slightly. "How could you possibly know that?" "I don't," Beaumont said simply. "But every artist leaves traces of themselves in how they look at beauty. You're not watching her. You're remembering something through her." Elias wanted to argue, but the truth of it was too close. He thought of nights long ago, when he'd written until dawn, his fingers ink-stained, heart alive with the certainty that words could change something. Him, the world, maybe both. But that belief had faded. One headline, one loss, one silence at a time. When the song ended, Clara thanked the small audience with a soft nod. Applause scattered like rain on the windows. Then she disappeared behind the curtain. Elias felt an odd pull to follow, though he didn't know what he'd say if he did. Beaumont leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Do you believe in coincidence?" Elias blinked. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because you were meant to hear that song tonight." Elias sighed. "You sound like a priest." "I'm worse," Beaumont said with a grin. "A storyteller." Elias tilted his head. "Is that what you do?" "Not anymore," the man said. "Now I just pass on what others forget." The waiter brought another round. The cafe had thinned out. Only a few tables remained occupied. A couple whispered near the window. An older woman hummed quietly to herself by the bar. The storm's rhythm had softened into something like a heartbeat. Beaumont opened his leather notebook. Inside were pages filled with a mix of handwriting. Some neat, some hurried, some barely legible. Elias caught glimpses of words: river, mirror, forgiveness, return. "Do you keep them all?" Elias asked. "Only the ones that refuse to leave," Beaumont said. "Stories have tempers, you know. The ones we ignore, they haunt us. The ones we honor, they teach us." Elias leaned back, letting the words settle. "And which are you tonight?" Beaumont smiled, haunted of course, but perhaps ready to teach, if someone cares to listen. The band began a final song for the set, soft and without lyrics. Clara did not return to sing. The music floated freely, unanchored. Elias felt something shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Beaumont closed his notebook. "You've lost something," he said quietly, "and not just the will to write." Elias's jaw tightened. "You make a lot of assumptions for a stranger." "Not assumptions," Beaumont said gently. "Reflections. The way the rain finds itself in the window. It doesn't ask permission." Elias stared into his coffee, where the light of the lamp trembled on the surface. "What is it you think I've lost?" "Belief," Beaumont said simply. "Not in the world. No one sane believes in that anymore. But in your own ability to translate its noise into something worth keeping." Elias wanted to look away, but instead, he met the man's eyes. "You talk like you've been there." "I still am," Beaumont admitted. "That's why I come here, to remember what I forgot. That stories are just mirrors waiting for someone to look." The music ended. For a moment, even the rain paused. Then Clara reappeared, carrying her coat, ready to leave. She passed by their table, offering a polite smile. Beaumont raised his glass slightly. "Miss Clara," he greeted her. She stopped, surprised. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," Beaumont said, "but you've been singing to my friend here all night." Clara's gaze shifted to Elias. He tried to smile, but felt strangely exposed. "You have a remarkable voice," he managed. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's easier to sing than to talk some nights." "Then tonight, you spoke clearly," Beaumont said. Clara smiled at that, a real one this time. "Good night, gentlemen." She left before Elias could reply. They watched her disappear into the rain. Beaumont leaned back and sighed. There it is, the ordinary magic. The world gives us a moment, and we spend years trying to name it. Elias nodded slowly. And if we fail, then we listen again, Beaumont said, because meaning doesn't vanish, it only hides in quieter places. The waiter dimmed the lamps. One by one, the tables emptied. Elias felt the night folding inward, the edges of the world softening. Beaumont stood, slipping his notebook into his coat. "Tomorrow I'll tell you a story," he said. "A strange one, about a man who forgot his own name." Elias frowned. "Is it true?" "All stories are," Beaumont said. Eventually, he left before Elias could ask more. Alone now. Elias looked toward the rain-washed window. The reflections of the lamps trembled like memory. He didn't know what had changed, only that something had begun. Outside, the rain kept talking, as if the night still had things to say. Morning would come eventually, but for now, the night belonged to the rain, and to the small cafe that pretended time didn't exist. When Elias returned the next evening, he told himself it was coincidence. The streets were glistening again. The same corner lamp flickered above the door of Le Cygne Noir, and the same hush greeted him inside. Only tonight, the hush felt expectant, as though the room itself had been waiting. Clara was already on stage. She held the microphone in both hands, eyes half closed, a cigarette resting on the piano behind her. The band began with a soft snare and the lazy heartbeat of a bass. The melody rose slow as smoke. Elias sat at his corner table, pretending to look through his notes, but every line of sound seemed to pull at the air around him. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked now and then, dipped unexpectedly, but that imperfection carried truth. Each phrase felt lived in, like something borrowed from memory. She sang of distance and return, of letters written and never sent. Somewhere between the verses, Elias stopped hearing the words and began feeling them. Beaumont wasn't there tonight. Elias noticed his absence like an unfinished sentence. Still, he could almost hear the man's voice in the back of his mind, saying something about mirrors and stories. The room dimmed further. Rain slid down the windows like a slow applause. Clara's song deepened. It wasn't the kind of performance meant to impress. It was confession disguised as melody. When she reached the final chorus, her voice softened, a whisper just above the instruments. Elias leaned forward, caught between wanting to understand and not daring to. It reminded him of reading a letter from someone who knew him too well. The last note held for a long trembling second, then faded. The cafe exhaled again. Glasses clinked, chairs shifted, but no one spoke loudly. She smiled briefly at the crowd, then turned to speak with the pianist. Elias noticed the way she touched the keys when she passed, just a fingertip across the wood, a private gesture of gratitude. Something about that small act moved him more than the song itself. He opened his notebook, finally. For months he had carried it like a burden, pages waiting like an accusation. Now he wrote 3 words without thinking. She sings truth. Then he closed it again, embarrassed by the simplicity. The waiter brought him coffee. "You like her songs?" Elias nodded. "They sound familiar. Most of them are her own," the waiter said. "Stories from people she meets." Elias looked up. "She writes about other people?" The waiter shrugged. "She listens, and somehow they end up in her music. Maybe she listens too well." Elias thought of Beaumont's comment. "You're not watching her. You're remembering something through her." He wondered what part of him she had unknowingly borrowed. After a while, Clara approached the bar for water. Elias hesitated, then stood. "Your song," he said quietly when she was near. "The one about letters. It was different tonight." She studied him for a moment, her eyes calm but curious. Different how? Like it was being sung for the first time. Her smile was small but real. Maybe it was. Songs change depending on who's listening. He wanted to ask more, but she was called back to the stage. She touched his sleeve briefly, a light passing contact, and said, "Keep listening." Then, when she began the next song, it was brighter, playful. The shift surprised him. The audience relaxed, laughter returning to the edges of the room. Elias realized how deliberate it was. This movement from melancholy to ease. She was guiding them, just as a good writer guides a reader through dark pages toward light. He scribbled another line in his notebook. Emotion is direction. The band improvised, the pianist smiling, the bassist swaying. It felt alive, unpolished. For the first time in years, Elias tapped his foot to rhythm instead of thought. He wasn't planning the next sentence in his head. He was just there, present, tasting the moment. When the set ended, Clara took her coat from the back of the stage. The crowd thinned as people drifted into the damp streets. Elias remained, unsure if he hoped she'd notice. She did. "You're a writer," she said as she approached. It wasn't a question. "Used to be." "That's like saying you used to breathe," she replied. "You either still do or you don't." He smiled faintly. "I think I forgot how." "Then maybe start by stealing a rhythm from somewhere," she said, gesturing toward the band, packing up. Music's just language that remembers to feel. Elias didn't know how to respond. Her tone wasn't instructive. It was kind, as if she'd once needed the same advice herself. Outside, thunder rolled, soft and distant. Clara looked toward the window. "Storm's not done," she said. "Seems the sky still has something to say." She turned to leave, then paused. "You know Beaumont, don't you?" Elias straightened. "You know him. Everyone here does," she said. "He's been coming for years. Tells stories no one believes, but everyone listens to anyway. He said he'd tell me one." "Then you're lucky," Clara said. "His stories have a way of finding their listeners when they're ready." She pulled her coat tight and left into the rain. Elias watched through the fogged glass as she disappeared under her umbrella, her reflection bending across puddles. The band's laughter echoed faintly behind him, but his attention stayed on the door she'd passed through. He thought about what she'd said, about rhythm, about remembering to feel. It sounded simple, but something in it struck deeper than philosophy. Maybe stories weren't built from perfect words, after all. Maybe they were built from moments like this. A song, a voice, the stranger's truth sung into existence. The rain grew louder. Elias stayed until the last table was cleared. The waiter extinguished the candles one by one. Shadows lengthened across the walls. As he gathered his things, he found Beaumont's business card beneath his notebook, a card that hadn't been there before. It read only, "Tomorrow night, same table." Elias stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or feel uneasy. He looked toward the door again. Rain glimmered against the street like spilled light. He slipped the card into his pocket, sensing that the night had already decided his next step. For now, he wrote one final note before leaving. Listen first, write later. Outside, the storm accepted him with open arms. The sound of Clara's last song lingered in the rain, faint but steady, as if the city itself was humming along. The next evening arrived, wrapped in fog. The city's lamps flickered through it like shy stars, and the puddles from the earlier rain had turned the streets into mirrors. Elias walked slowly, the collar of his coat turned up, the note from Beaumont folded in his pocket like an unanswered question. Inside Le Seigneur Noir, the same warm haze awaited him. Smoke, amber light, low voices. The jazz trio was tuning, the sound of the piano keys soft as footsteps on old wood. Elias slipped into his usual corner. He hadn't planned to become a creature of habit, but this table seemed to remember him now. Beaumont was already there. He sat with his hat resting on the table, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him, and that same calm expression of someone who had seen too much but learned not to flinch. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. Elias smiled faintly.
You left me no choice. You invited a story, and I'm weak enough to be curious.
"Good," Beaumont said. "Curiosity is how the soul breathes." He gestured for Elias to sit. The waiter brought coffee without being asked, and for a while neither man spoke. The band started a slow tune, clarinet and brushed drums, something wistful but alive. Finally, Beaumont leaned forward. "Have you ever forgotten something so completely that when you remembered it, it felt like finding a stranger inside yourself?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Every time I try to write." "Then you'll understand this story," Beaumont said. He opened his notebook. The pages were yellowed, edges frayed, the ink faded in places. "It's an old one," he said, "but I've changed it enough that it feels new again. That's what stories demand. They shed their skins to stay alive." He began without preamble, his voice slow and low, weaving itself between the sounds of rain outside and the quiet clatter of cups. "There was once a man who woke one morning to find his name missing, not forgotten, but gone, as if it had been erased from every place it had ever lived. His mind, his letters, his friends' memories. He could speak, but when he introduced himself, no sound came after the word. I am..." Elias frowned slightly. "A metaphor, I assume." Beaumont smiled. "You decide." The man searched every corner of his home, looked through notebooks and letters, but wherever his name should have been, there was only a blank space. He tried to remember who he'd been before, but memories dissolve when you have no name to anchor them. So he set out into the world, hoping someone would recognize him, but no one did. He passed friends on the street. None saw him. He spoke to strangers, they heard him, but his words didn't stay. The world treated him like wind, something that brushed past without consequence. Elias stirred his coffee. "Sounds like a writer after publication." Beaumont chuckled. "Yes, perhaps." The man grew weary and stopped by a river one evening. He knelt to drink and saw his reflection, but it too had changed. The face staring back was his own, and yet not. It flickered, shifting between expressions he didn't remember having. In despair, he threw a stone into the water. The ripples distorted his reflection further, and for the first time he realized that the more he tried to recognize himself, the less real he became. So he sat quietly instead, watching until the water settled. When it finally did, he saw not his face, but his surroundings. Trees, sky, movement, all reflected together. It was then he understood. He was never only the man in the water. He was the one watching, the river itself, and the world reflected. Beaumont paused to sip his drink. The next morning, his name returned, but it no longer mattered. The story ended without ceremony. Elias waited for some moral, some closing phrase, but none came. "That's it?" he asked. "That's everything," Beaumont said. Elias leaned back, frustrated and intrigued in equal measure. So he loses his name, realizes he's part of the world, and that's supposed to mean something. "It means everything," Beaumont said softly. He stopped trying to be extraordinary. He remembered how to belong. Elias frowned, but the words struck somewhere deeper than he wanted to admit. The war had taken names too. Dreams, friendships, small pieces of self scattered across years. Maybe Beaumont's story wasn't so strange. Outside, thunder murmured again. Clara had not yet arrived, and the absence of her voice left the room slightly hollow. Beaumont seemed to notice Elias's wandering gaze. "You're waiting for the singer. She has a way of making the silence feel less heavy." "Ah," Beaumont said. "Then she's already done half her work." Elias looked back at him. "You speak like someone who's lived inside a metaphor for too long." "That's what age does," Beaumont said. "It turns the literal into symbols until the world makes sense again." He closed his notebook and slid it across the table. "Here, read the next page." Elias hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was delicate, the ink uneven. It wasn't the story of the nameless man anymore. It was something else entirely. A single line at the top read, "Every truth returns in disguise." Below it, a paragraph. "We do not lose ourselves all at once. We vanish in gestures, in words we stop saying, in songs we stop singing. And then one evening, a stranger tells our story back to us, and we call it coincidence." Elias looked up, startled. "Did you write this?" "I don't remember," Beaumont said. "Maybe it wrote me." Elias closed the notebook slowly, unsure whether to laugh or feel unsettled. "You talk like a philosopher." "No," Beaumont said. "I talk like a man who listens." The band ended their song. The room applauded softly. The rain had slowed to a whisper. Beaumont finished his bourbon and stood. "That's enough story for tonight. The rest must find you on its own." Elias frowned. "You're leaving already." "The story's done," Beaumont said. "Now comes the part where you decide whether to believe it." He placed a coin on the table, tipped his hat, and walked toward the door. When he opened it, a breath of rain-scented air swept through the room. Elias sat there long after he'd gone. The empty chair across from him felt like an echo. He looked at the notebook still resting under his hand, unsure whether Beaumont meant for him to keep it. He opened it again. The first page was blank now, the story gone. A shiver ran through him. He stared until the waiter asked if he was finished with his coffee. "Yes," Elias said softly. Finished and not. He left the cafe without looking back. Outside, the city glistened as if freshly washed. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, like pages waiting to be written on. Somewhere, not far off, he thought he heard Clara's voice, carried by the night air, a melody gentle enough to believe. Elias turned toward the sound, unaware that the next step he took would lead him deeper into Beaumont's unfinished tale. The next day arrived grey and slow, the kind of morning that never quite woke up. Elias spent it walking aimlessly through narrow streets, slick with leftover rain. The cafe's conversations replayed in his head like echoes from another life. Beaumont's story of the nameless man clung to him, not as a riddle, but as something half remembered from a dream. he hadn't realized he'd dreamt. By dusk, he found himself again before the door of Lessing Noir. He didn't plan it, his steps had simply drifted there, drawn by routine or magnetism. The sound of piano notes spilled softly through the walls, coaxing him inside. Clara was already singing when he entered, her voice low, unhurried, like the evening itself. The cafe was nearly empty. Only a handful of patrons lingered, their faces bathed in lamplight, their eyes following her every word. Elias slipped into his corner, still carrying Beaumont's notebook in his coat pocket. Clara's song tonight wasn't about loss or longing. It was about memory, the kind that hides beneath laughter, waiting to be remembered when the room grows quiet. Her tone brushed against something tender, something Elias had kept locked away since before the war. He didn't notice Beaumont until the song ended. The old man appeared beside him, as naturally as rain returning to glass. "You brought it," Beaumont said, nodding toward the notebook. "I wasn't sure if I was supposed to." "You were," Beaumont replied. "Stories choose where they want to be." He sat down, motioning for 2 coffees. "Now, Elias, about our nameless man. You heard the ending, but not the heart of it. The truth was never in the words, it was hidden in what came next." Elias raised an eyebrow. "There's more?" "There's always more." Beaumont smiled faintly. That night by the river, after the man saw the world reflected, he fell asleep under the trees. When he woke, a child was standing over him, holding a mirror made of polished tin. The boy said, "You look like someone I used to know." The man asked, "Who was he?" And the boy shrugged. "The storyteller," he said. "He told everyone else's stories but forgot his own." Beaumont paused, eyes glinting under the dim light. That's when the man understood. His name had not been taken, it had been spent. "Spent," Elias repeated. "Yes," Beaumont said. "Each word, each promise, each silence, everything we give away in the name of meaning, takes a little piece of us with it." The man had spent his name on too many unfinished stories. The river gave him back what remained. Elias felt a strange pull in his chest. The story was too close, too familiar. He thought of all the words he'd written that no one had read, the dreams he'd traded for sentences that never found their end. Beaumont studied him. "You see it, don't you? The river is time, the mirror is art, and the boy, pacifier, is the part of us that still believes." Elias finished quietly. Beaumont smiled. "Exactly." The waiter placed the coffees down. The steam rose between them, twisting like smoke. Clara's next song began. A slower tune now, just piano and voice. "She sings the way stories heal," Beaumont murmured, "through repetition. Every chorus is a small remembering." Elias listened. The lyrics told of a traveler who wandered the earth searching for his reflection. When he finally found it, it was smiling back, older, calmer. "She's singing your parable," Elias said. Beaumont nodded. "She always does, one way or another. Her songs find the people who need them." Elias glanced toward the stage. Clara's eyes were closed. Her hand rested on the microphone, as if steadying herself against the weight of the melody. Something about her calmness unsettled him. It was the peace of someone who had walked through storms and no longer feared rain. The applause came softly, like a sigh. Clara thanked the room and stepped down. Instead of leaving, she crossed toward Elias and Beaumont. "I was hoping you'd both come tonight," she said. "You knew we would," Beaumont replied. She smiled. I heard the story last night about the man who lost his name. Elias looked up, surprised. He told you? Not exactly, Clara said. He told someone who told me. Stories travel faster than truth. Beaumont chuckled. You make them travel well. Clara's expression turned thoughtful. I've been thinking about that man. Maybe he didn't lose his name. Maybe he just outgrew it. Elias tilted his head. Outgrew? Yes, she said. Sometimes we live through so much that the person our name belonged to can't contain us anymore. Maybe that's not loss. Maybe it's becoming. Her words fell gently, but they landed deep. Elias realized then that the cafe, the rain, the music, all of it was conspiring towards something he hadn't named yet. Beaumont tapped a notebook. Write that down. Elias hesitated. What for? So you can see it later when you forget again, Beaumont said. That's what writing is. A letter from clarity to confusion. Elias opened the notebook and wrote. Outgrowing the name is not losing it. When he looked up, Clara was watching him with quiet amusement. You're writing again, she said. Borrowing your courage, Elias replied. She laughed softly. Then I'll lend it until you remember your own. The room dimmed as the waiter lowered the lights. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, though the rain hadn't yet returned. Beaumont stood, smoothing his coat. That's enough for tonight. Every story needs silence after it breathes. Clara nodded toward him. Will you be back tomorrow? Beaumont smiled. Only if the story demands it. He left without another word, disappearing into the street's haze. Elias and Clara sat in companionable quiet. She sipped her tea. He's an odd one, she said, but I think he sees more than most. Elias traced the edge of the notebook. He sees what people try not to. Clara looked toward the rain-streaked window. That can be lonely. Maybe, Elias said. Or maybe it's how he stays alive. Outside, lightning flickered faintly, lighting the fog. Inside, the last notes from the piano lingered, dissolving into silence. Clara gathered her coat, preparing to leave. Do you ever get tired of singing? Elias asked. She smiled. Only when no one listens. But tonight, someone did. Elias felt warmth rise in his chest. Then I suppose I'll be here again tomorrow. I know, she said softly. The story isn't finished yet. She left, her footsteps fading into the rhythm of the coming rain. Elias stayed a while longer, notebook open before him. On the next page, he wrote a single sentence. Maybe the nameless man was every writer who ever forgot what mattered. He stared at the words until the letters blurred, then closed the book and leaned back. The rain began again, tapping gently against the window, steady, deliberate, and familiar. Somewhere beyond it, a saxophone played faintly, as if the city itself had joined the conversation. Elias listened, realizing, for the first time in months, that silence could hold more meaning than words. And in that quiet, he understood. Beaumont's tale hadn't ended. It had only folded itself into his own. The next evening arrived on a restless wind. The rain had thinned to mist, brushing against the pavement like breath. Elias walked faster than usual, notebook clutched under his arm, Beaumont's words replaying in his head. Every truth returns in disguise. He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but the phrase refused to leave him. When he entered Le Cygne Noir, the cafe felt different. The crowd was smaller, quieter, their faces turned toward the stage in anticipation. The lamps burned lower, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and tobacco. Clara stood near the piano, speaking softly with the pianist, her expression thoughtful. Elias took his usual seat, setting the notebook on the table. He'd written more during the past 24 hours than in the last 6 months, though most of it made little sense. Half phrases, incomplete thoughts, and questions without answers. Still, it felt good to fill pages again. Beaumont was late. Elias checked the door every few minutes, half expecting the old man to materialize from the rain, as before. But tonight, there was no sign of him. When Clara began to sing, her tone was gentler than usual. The song spoke of choices and echoes, of people who waited too long to change. Elias listened, uneasy. The melody curled through the cafe like smoke, and in its rise and fall, he heard his own hesitation mirrored back. Halfway through the second verse, his pen slipped from his fingers. The sound was small, but Clara's gaze found him immediately. She smiled faintly, as if to say it's all right, then looked away. Something about her calmness made Elias restless. He couldn't decide if her voice was comforting or accusing. When the song ended, the room applauded softly. Clara stepped down and approached the bar, glancing toward him. "You seem troubled," she said. "Maybe I am. By the storyteller," Elias said. "He makes everything sound simple, but nothing is." Clara tilted her head. "Simple doesn't mean easy." He sighed. "It's not that. He stopped, searching for the right word. "I don't know if I believe him." "Then don't," she said. "Belief isn't required. Listening is." Her tone was neither sharp nor soft, just certain. She left before he could answer, returning to the stage for another set. Elias stared into his coffee, watching the reflection of the overhead lamp ripple with each movement. The reflection looked like a small sun trapped in dark water. He thought of Beaumont's parable, the man by the river, and suddenly the story felt uncomfortably personal. Maybe that was what bothered him. He didn't want the story to be about him. He pushed the notebook away and stood, pacing near the window. The rain had begun again, faint but persistent, tracing crooked paths down the glass. Outside, the streetlights blurred into soft halos. Inside, the world felt too small, too precise, as though every breath might reveal something he wasn't ready to face. When he turned back, Beaumont was standing by the door. The old man removed his hat, shook the rain from it, and smiled. "You look like someone who's arguing with a mirror," he said. Elias didn't return the smile. "You could have warned me." "About what?" "That your story wasn't finished." Beaumont walked to the table and sat. "No story ever is." "You made it sound like the man found peace," Elias said. "But you left out the part where it ruins him first." Beaumont raised an eyebrow. "Ah, so it is your story now." Elias sat down slowly. "You said he found his name again, that it didn't matter anymore. But that's not peace. That's surrender." Beaumont took a sip of his drink. "Perhaps, but sometimes surrender is the only door left open." Elias shook his head. "You speak like it's wisdom, but it sounds like giving up." "It depends," Beaumont said. "Are you surrendering to despair or to truth?" Elias laughed quietly. "What truth? That the world keeps moving. whether or not we write about it, Beaumont said. That healing doesn't come from forcing meaning, but from noticing it. Elias leaned back, frustrated. That's easy for you to say. You already have your story. Beaumont studied him carefully. And you think that makes it easier? My friend, having a story means living with its ending every day. They fell silent. On stage, Clara's final song began, slower than usual, almost like a lullaby. The piano chords dripped like rainwater, each note dissolving into the next. Elias found himself watching her again, drawn to the stillness in her presence. She wasn't performing, she was sharing something she'd already made peace with. He envied that. When the music ended, Beaumont stood. You're resisting the part that matters, he said. Which is? The reflection. Elias frowned. You mean self-awareness? No, Beaumont said. Acceptance. The man by the river didn't understand himself by thinking harder. He saw himself only when he stopped trying to. Elias scoffed. I'm not a monk. I can't just sit beside a river and wait for enlightenment. Beaumont smiled. No one said you had to. You already have your river. Elias followed his gaze to the cafe window. Outside, the rain streaked downward, glinting under the lamplight. For a moment, the glass did look like moving water. His own reflection trembled there, blurred, fractured, but undeniably his. You see, Beaumont said softly, every night offers you a mirror. You just refuse to look long enough. Elias didn't reply. He reached for his notebook, but his hands hesitated. The pages inside felt heavier now, as though the words themselves carried judgment. Beaumont placed a hand on his arm. You don't need to fix yourself, Elias. You only need to witness what's already changing. Something in his tone, the calm certainty, made Elias's frustration collapse into weariness. He looked up, meeting the old man's eyes. I don't know if I can. You already are, Beaumont said. You came back. Clara's laughter drifted from the stage as she thanked the audience. The lights brightened slightly, returning the room to its familiar warmth. Beaumont stood, preparing to leave. When the river calls again, he said, don't argue this time, just listen. He placed a coin on the table and walked toward the door. Elias watched him go, then turned back to the window. His reflection shimmered beside the rain. Uncertain, but present, he whispered quietly to himself, listening isn't the hard part. Believing what I hear is. The storm outside answered with a distant rumble, neither agreement nor denial. Elias opened the notebook. On the first blank page, he wrote a single line. The reflection never lies, but it never speaks first. He closed the book gently. The cafe around him had emptied. Even the music had stopped. Only the soft hum of rain remained. He stayed until the lamps were extinguished, the room dissolving into shadow. As he stepped outside, the cool air met him like an old friend. The mist touched his face, light and forgiving. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, faint but familiar, like a story preparing its next chapter. The storm broke fully that night, not in fury, but in persistence. The soft, endless rain that blurred the edges of the city and made every streetlight look like a candle in fog. Elias walked slower than usual toward Le Cygne Noir, his notebook tucked beneath his arm like something alive. The rhythm of raindrops matched his breath, steady and uneven, all at once. When he reached the cafe, the usual hum of jazz and laughter met him at the door, but beneath it there was tension. The piano's chords sounded a little off, the air thicker somehow. He stepped inside, shook off his coat, and found Beaumont already waiting at their corner table. The old man looked weary tonight, his coat still damp, his eyes rimmed with tired kindness.
"Evening," he said. "You look like you've been arguing with ghosts."
"Maybe just myself," Elias replied, sitting. "Same difference, isn't it?" Beaumont smiled faintly. "Not if you listen carefully. One tends to whisper, the other demands answers." Clara was on stage, her hands wrapped around the microphone. She looked beautiful in that quiet, steady way. The kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself, but lingers in the corners of memory. The band began a familiar tune, soft and slow. Elias leaned back, letting the rhythm fill the spaces, his thoughts left open. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. Then, halfway through a verse, the record player stuttered, the saxophone crackled, the piano froze mid-note, and suddenly the room was silent. The audience glanced around. Clara stepped away from the microphone, her brow furrowing. The pianist lifted his hands, helpless. The silence wasn't just absence, it was presence, thick and heavy, pressing against every listener. Elias felt something strange inside him, a tightening, as if the sudden stillness mirrored something breaking loose within. Beaumont, however, looked serene, almost expectant. "Well," he murmured, "there it is." "What?" Elias asked quietly. "The break," Beaumont said. "Every story needs one." Clara tapped the microphone once. Testing. Nothing. She glanced at the band, then toward the audience. "Seems the rain doesn't like competition," she said lightly. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Her composure steadied everyone else. Beaumont leaned closer to Elias. "That sound, the jump, the skip, it's what makes the music human. Imperfection is the rhythm we trust most." Elias frowned. "You sound like you planned this." Beaumont chuckled. "No, but life plans such things better than I ever could." Clara set the microphone aside. "We'll play something without the machine," she announced. "Old-fashioned, like the first nights after the war." The pianist nodded, and the drummer brushed his snares softly. Clara began to sing again, but this time without amplification. Her voice floated through the cafe naturally, unguarded, almost fragile. The rain outside joined her as quiet percussion. Something shifted in the room. The audience leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but reverence. Every word felt closer, truer. Elias could feel the vibrations of her voice against the glass beside him, as if the building itself was listening. Beaumont closed his eyes. "Do you hear it now?" he asked. Elias nodded slowly. "It's different. It's honest," Beaumont said. "No microphone, no distance, just sound meeting silence." Elias thought of the reflection in the cafe window, of the line he had written the night before. The reflection never lies, but it never speaks first. Maybe this was the reflection speaking now, through the break in the record, through Clara's raw voice. She sang a verse about forgetting and being remembered. Anyway, the line caught him. "Even if my name fades, the song still knows where to find me." Elias's throat tightened. Beaumont noticed, but said nothing. When the song ended, the audience didn't clap right away. They sat in stillness, letting the final note dissolve into air. Then, slowly, applause began. Soft, respectful. Clara smiled, touched her chest once in gratitude. and stepped down from the stage. Elias leaned forward, elbows on the table. Why does it feel like the silence says more than the song? Beaumont's eyes warmed. Because silence is the part of the story the writer can't control. He reached into his coat and produced a small object, a thin piece of vinyl, cracked clean through the middle. This was the record that skipped, he said. Take it. Elias hesitated. Why? Because you're the one who heard it break, Beaumont said. That makes it yours. Elias turned the piece of vinyl in his hands. The jagged edge glinted in the lamplight. It's ruined. No, Beaumont corrected softly. It's complete. Elias looked up confused. Complete? Beaumont nodded. Everything ends in pieces, Elias. That's how we remember it was real. Clara approached their table then, cheeks flushed from the performance. You two always look like you're plotting a mystery, she teased. Not plotting, Beaumont said. Just deciphering. Clara smiled. Well, I hope you find your answer before the rain stops. Nights like this don't last forever. Neither do stories, Elias said. She glanced at him, amused. Maybe that's why we tell them. The band began to pack up their instruments. The other patrons left, slowly murmuring about the sudden silence that had felt like magic. Soon the cafe emptied, leaving only the three of them and the rain. Beaumont finished his drink, stood and adjusted his coat. You both should stay a while, he said. Let the quiet settle. It has more to say than I do. Clara tilted her head. You're not staying. Not tonight, he said. Tonight belongs to the ones who are still learning to listen. He tipped his hat, then left into the rain, his shape swallowed by mist. Elias and Clara remained at the table, neither speaking. The rain hit the windows in soft, even patterns. Clara traced a circle on the glass with her fingertip. Funny, she said, how everything can stop for a second, and yet feel perfectly right. Elias looked at the broken record in his hand. Maybe that's what meaning is, a pause we finally stop resisting. Clara smiled. That sounds like something Beaumont would say. He laughed quietly. I suppose he's starting to infect me. She leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the rain. Then maybe that's not a bad thing. They sat there until the lamps dimmed, until the rain softened to drizzle. The city outside was blurred and beautiful, like watercolor still wet. Elias slipped the broken record into his coat pocket. Do you ever wonder, he asked softly, if the music remembers where it left off? Clara opened her eyes and met his gaze. Only when someone's still listening. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, the silence inside him didn't ache, it just existed, gentle, patient, alive. Outside, the rain began to fade, but somewhere far above the rooftops, thunder hummed again, low, distant, like applause from the sky. Dawn came muted, like the world was whispering. Elias woke before the city stirred. The echo of Clara's song still woven through his mind. He had fallen asleep at his desk, notebook open, the broken piece of vinyl resting beside it. The faint smell of rain drifted through the open window, and for a moment he wasn't sure what century he was in or whose story he was living. He touched the record's edge. It was smooth in some places, jagged in others, beautiful in its imperfection, like a truth finally spoken. He turned it over once, then slipped it into his coat pocket. By evening, he found himself again walking toward Le Cygne Noir. He didn't know why. Habit, curiosity, or simply the need to be near something that felt alive. The streets were slick from a fresh drizzle, the lamps reflecting in puddles like liquid amber. When he entered the cafe, Clara was already there. She sat alone at the bar, a cup of tea steaming before her. The usual chatter was gone. Only a few quiet souls occupied the back tables. The piano sat closed, its keys hidden, its silence patient. Clara looked up as he approached. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't stay away." "Neither could I," she admitted. "The rain sounds better from in here." He smiled faintly and took his seat beside her. The bar was polished smooth by time, and the overhead lamps cast small halos across its surface. "I didn't see Beaumont last night after he left," she said. "Did you?" Elias shook his head. "No, he's always where you least expect him, and never where you hope." Clara sipped her tea. "He told me once that stories choose their endings, not us." "That sounds like him," Elias said. "I'm beginning to think he's a story pretending to be a man." She laughed softly, the sound like glass tapping gently. "Maybe we all are." The door opened then, and a gust of cool air swept through. Beaumont entered slowly, hat in hand, rain glistening on his coat. He looked older somehow, though perhaps it was only the light. "Evening," he greeted. "I see the story's favourite two characters are still here, only because you keep writing us into it," Clara said, smiling. "Someone has to," Beaumont replied, "otherwise it ends too soon." He joined them at the bar. The waiter brought bourbon without being asked. For a while, none of them spoke. The cafe's old clock ticked softly in the background, keeping time as if out of habit rather than duty. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "The record you gave me," he said. "What was I supposed to learn from it?" Beaumont considered this. "Nothing," he said. "Learning is for lessons. Stories are for remembering." "Then what should I remember?" "That the break isn't the end. It's the beginning of hearing differently." Elias frowned, but before he could speak, the lights flickered. A brief hush fell over the cafe. Outside, the rain returned, tapping rhythmically on the glass, an insistent pattern that sounded almost intentional. Clara tilted her head, listening. "It's the same rhythm," she whispered. "What rhythm?" Elias asked. "The one from the night the record broke." Beaumont smiled faintly. "Ah, the city is kind tonight. It remembers its own melody." Elias listened. The rain really did sound like a song, steady, looping, familiar. And suddenly, from somewhere deep within memory, another rhythm answered, the sound of typewriter keys, quick and certain, from years ago. He froze. "I know this sound," he murmured. "I used to hear it every morning when I wrote." Beaumont nodded. "There it is, the memory you buried beneath silence." Elias's chest tightened. The cafe blurred for a moment, replaced by another room, his old apartment before the war. Morning light spilling across stacks of paper, the air alive with creation. He saw himself younger, hopeful, believing words could change something more than just himself. Then he saw the day it all stopped, the telegram, the absence, the stillness that followed. He blinked, the cafe returning around him. The rain still played its quiet rhythm, but now it sounded different, like a heartbeat. Clara watched him carefully. "Where did you go just now?" "Back," he said. "Too far, maybe." "Then take what you need and come back here," she said gently. "You don't have to live there anymore." Elias exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were trembling. He looked down at the notebook before him, its pages heavy with half-truths and fragments. I stopped writing because I thought stories were supposed to fix things, he said, but they only show you what's broken. Beaumont set his glass down. No, Elias, they show you what's worth keeping. Elias met his eyes. You sound certain. I've lived long enough to know certainty is a luxury, Beaumont said. But remembrance, that's necessity. Clara placed her hand over Elias's, steady and warm. So remember, she said softly. Not perfectly, just honestly. For a long moment, they sat like that, the three of them listening to the rain weave its quiet spell. The world outside had faded into watercolor. Only the soft glow of the lamps and the reflection of faces in glass remained. Elias opened the notebook. His pen hesitated, then began to move. He didn't think, didn't plan. The words came like rain, uncontrolled, honest, inevitable. He wrote about the river and the nameless man, about songs that outlasted their singers, about a cafe where silence had learned to speak. He wrote until the ink smudged beneath his hand. When he looked up, Beaumont was watching him with quiet pride. Clara smiled, her eyes shining in the dim light. You see, Beaumont said, the story doesn't end. It renews itself through whoever's still willing to tell it. Elias closed the notebook carefully. And if no one tells it, then the rain will, Clara said. Outside, lightning flared briefly, lighting the wet cobblestones in silver. The thunder that followed was soft, like a sigh from the heavens. Beaumont stood. It's time, he said. For what? Elias asked. For you to remember without me. Elias's breath caught. You're leaving? Not leaving, Beaumont said, his voice gentle. Just becoming part of the story again. That's where I belong. He put on his hat and turned toward the door. Clara rose, her voice trembling slightly. Will we see you again? Beaumont smiled. If the story requires it. Then he stepped outside, swallowed by rain and lamplight. Elias sat very still. The door clicked shut, and the cafe felt strangely lighter, as if an unseen weight had been lifted. Clara reached for the notebook. Keep writing, she said softly, before the memory fades. He nodded, and when he looked down again, he noticed something tucked between the pages, a torn scrap of paper he hadn't seen before. 3 words, written in Beaumont's steady hand. The river waits. Elias smiled. Then I suppose I shouldn't keep it waiting. Outside, the rain continued its patient rhythm, each drop like punctuation to a story still unfolding. The next morning carried the smell of wet earth and possibility. The storm had moved east, leaving behind streets that glistened like glass, and a hush that made every footstep sound deliberate. Elias walked without hurry. He didn't need to. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt time moving with him instead of against him. He found Le Signoir still closed, chairs stacked on tables, the faint hum of a broom sweeping within. Clara was there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, humming softly as she tidied the bar. She looked up when he knocked and smiled through the window, that same quiet smile that seemed to carry warmth even through glass. Too early for coffee, she called as she unlocked the door, but not too early for company. Elias stepped inside. The scent of yesterday's rain lingered, mixed with polish and something faintly sweet, perhaps the memory of tobacco smoke. I thought I'd find you here, he said. You always do, she replied. Writers and wanderers both have a habit of returning to the same places, hoping they'll sound different each time. He set his notebook on the counter. You're not singing today. Not yet, she said, leaning the broom against the wall. Music needs silence to grow out of, same as words. He nodded, running a hand through his damp hair. The air in the cafe was cool and gentle, a kind of peace he'd forgotten how to recognize. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee from the percolator on the stove. She slid one toward him. You look lighter, she said. Maybe I am. Remembered something? Elias opened the notebook, turning to the page with Beaumont's last note. The river waits. He left this for me. Clara read the words and smiled faintly. Then I suppose you'll have to go to it. I don't even know where to begin, he admitted. It's a metaphor, isn't it? Most things worth finding are, she said. Maybe it's not a place, but a moment. Maybe it's just the part of you that's been waiting to flow again. Elias took a slow sip of coffee. You talk like him now. She laughed quietly. He taught me to listen. You're the one he taught to speak again. Her words struck gently but deeply. Elias glanced toward the window. Sunlight broke through clouds, scattering across puddles outside. He's really gone, isn't he? Maybe, she said. Or maybe he was never only here. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that feels like music without sound. Then Clara reached across the counter and rested her hand on his. You know, she said softly, the first time I ever sang here, I was terrified. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the microphone. But an old man sitting in the front row smiled and mouthed something to me. I couldn't hear him, but I read his lips. You already have the song. Elias's eyes widened slightly. Beaumont. She nodded. He was always reminding people what they already had. Elias closed the notebook. So what do I do now? Write again? Pretend the world hasn't changed? Clara tilted her head. No, you write because the world has changed. You don't write to forget the storms. You write to show that you survived them. Her gaze softened. You said once that stories only show what's broken, but that's not true, Elias. They show where the light got in. The line settled in his mind like a seed. He smiled, the smallest, truest smile he'd managed in years. You're wiser than you pretend to be. I'm just a singer, she said, but there was kindness in the denial. We learn our lessons out loud. He laughed quietly, a sound that startled him by how natural it felt. After a while, Clara stood and walked to the piano. She opened it, pressing a few keys to test their tone. The notes were soft, hesitant, but pure. Play something, she said. I can't play. Then try, she insisted. Just a note. Elias hesitated, then sat beside her. His fingers hovered uncertainly over the keys. The surface felt cool beneath his skin. He pressed one key, then another. Awkward, hesitant, yet strangely freeing. There, Clara said. Now you've begun again. He looked at her. That's it? That's always it, she said with a gentle grin. Starting never looks grand. It just sounds like the smallest step toward remembering who you were before fear moved in. They played together for a while, Clara weaving simple melodies, Elias adding uneven notes that somehow fit. The sound filled the cafe, imperfect but alive. Each mistake became part of the rhythm, each pause an unspoken word. When the final chord faded, Clara looked at him and whispered, "Do you hear it now?" "Hear what?" "The river," she said. "It's not out there somewhere. It's you." He let the silence stretch. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like water reaching its shore. Clara stood and poured more coffee. "When you leave this place," she said, "don't look for another story to tell. Let this one end quietly. The next will find you when it's ready." Elias nodded, though he didn't trust his voice enough to answer. Outside, the morning brightened. The train whistle drifted faintly through the distance, low and steady. Clara glanced at the sound. "You should catch that one." He raised an eyebrow. "Going where?" She smiled. "Wherever stories go when they need new scenery." He gathered his coat and notebook. "Will I see you again?" Clara leaned against the bar, her eyes warm. "You already will," she said, "in every word you write." Elias hesitated at the door. The sunlight caught her hair, turning it into threads of gold. She waved, just once, and he returned the gesture. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and beginnings. The cafe door closed softly behind him, and for a long moment he stood there, listening to the street, to the train's distant rhythm, to the quiet certainty growing in his chest. He opened the notebook and read Beaumont's note one more time. "The river waits." Then beneath it, he wrote, "I'm coming home." As he walked toward the station, the wind carried the faintest trace of music behind him. A woman's voice, steady and kind, singing not to an audience but to the morning itself. It was Clara's voice, and though he couldn't make out the words, he knew what they meant. The story had done its work. The train station was quieter than Elias remembered. Only the occasional announcement echoed through the hall, followed by the metallic sigh of departing cars. Outside, mist gathered over the tracks, curling around the lights like smoke. He bought a ticket without asking where it led, only trusting that movement itself was enough. As the train began to move, he opened his notebook on his lap. The handwriting of the past nights stared back at him, uneven, hurried, alive. Between the lines, coffee stains, and the faint outline of a fingerprint, his own or Beaumont's, he couldn't tell anymore. The rhythm of the train matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He began to write again, not about Beaumont or Clara or the cafe, but about something quieter, about moments that didn't need to mean anything to matter. He wrote about the sound of rain on windows, about the pause before a song, about the warmth of someone's hand that didn't promise forever, but promised now. Outside, the city fell away. Green hills and fog took its place, the kind of landscape that made silence feel enormous. The train clicked steadily over the tracks, its pattern both hypnotic and grounding. He wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page. Meaning isn't found, it's remembered. The words didn't feel forced. They felt like a truth he'd been carrying, waiting to notice. After a while, he stopped writing and looked out the window. Fields blurred past. The child in the seat ahead leaned against his mother, murmuring questions about the rain. Elias smiled faintly. He thought of Clara's advice, how songs were just confessions given rhythm, and realized stories were the same. They didn't explain life. They revealed how it sounded when we finally stopped running from it. He rested his pen, letting the train's motion do the talking. Hours passed. The rain returned, soft at first, then heavier. He watched it stream along the glass, splitting the reflection of his face into pieces. It reminded him of Beaumont's parable, the man by the river, and for the first time, he didn't resist the image. He simply watched himself dissolve and reappear with each flicker of light. When the conductor passed, Elias asked how far the line went. "All the way to the coast," the man said. "But few stay on that long. Not much waiting there, but sea and fog." Elias nodded. "That sounds like enough." He stayed quiet the rest of the way. Somewhere along the route, he realized the notebook had fallen open to a blank page. Without thinking, he wrote a single sentence, "Begin again." The simplicity of it startled him. It was the same phrase he'd scrawled weeks ago on a napkin back at Le Serenity. Only now, it no longer felt like a plea, it felt like a direction. The train slowed as it neared the coast. Elias stepped down onto a small platform, the air thick with salt and rain. The sea stretched before him, vast, grey, unjudging. He walked toward it until the boards beneath his feet turned to sand. The waves moved like breathing, slow inhales, soft exhales. Each one erased the footprints left by the last. Elias stood there for a long time, coat billowing, hair damp against his forehead. The rhythm of the ocean wasn't so different from the cafe's jazz, or the train, or the tapping of rain on windows. All of it pulsed with the same quiet heartbeat. He opened the notebook one last time. The pages fluttered in the wind, alive. He read the first words he'd written since returning to the cafe. "She sings truth." Below it, in new ink, he added, "And I write what her song remembers." He smiled. Behind him, footsteps approached. He turned and saw a small figure walking along the beach, a boy carrying a tin mirror. The sight jolted him for a heartbeat. The scene overlapped with Beaumont's story, as if fiction had slipped into the world unnoticed. The boy stopped a few feet away. "You dropped this," he said, holding out a page torn from a notebook. Elias accepted it carefully. It wasn't his page, but the handwriting was familiar, Beaumont's, looping and deliberate. On it was written, "The story ends only when you stop listening." "Where did you get this?" Elias asked. The boy shrugged. "An old man gave it to me at the station. Said I'd know who to find." Elias felt a warmth in his chest, half sorrow, half gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The boy smiled, tilted the mirror toward him, and ran off down the shore. In the mirror's reflection, Elias saw not just his own face, but the sea behind him, the clouds above, the faint shimmer of light breaking through. For the first time, he didn't look away. He sat on a piece of driftwood and began to write again. This time, not in search of resolution, but in honor of continuation. Every word felt lighter, freer, like skipping stones across water. He wrote until the light faded, until the rain began again, until the sound of the waves merged with memory. When he closed the notebook, he realized he no longer needed to know where Beaumont had gone. Some stories stayed not in their tellers, but in those willing to carry them forward. He looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the rain, and whispered, "I'm still listening." The wind carried the words away. He smiled once more and wrote the final line of the night, neat and certain. "The story will remember me too." Then he placed the notebook in his coat and began walking back toward the station, the path glistening ahead. The world washed clean. Behind him, the tide whispered softly against the shore. like pages turning themselves. The morning began in silver. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon, the color of unpolished pewter, and the air smelled faintly of sea and coal. Elias stood on the platform of the coastal station, notebook in hand, coat buttoned against the wind. He hadn't planned to stay the night by the shore, but the small inn near the dunes had felt like a place one could stop without guilt. Sleep had come easily, and for once his dreams had been kind. Now the train waited before him, its dark cars gleaming with mist. Steam curled upward, soft as breath. A whistle blew somewhere in the distance, a low, steady note that sounded more like an invitation than a command. Elias stepped aboard. The cabin was nearly empty. An old woman with knitting needles, a young soldier reading a letter, a man asleep beneath his hat. He chose a window seat and set his notebook on the small table beside him. The paper inside had begun to curl from the salt air, edges browned like leaves in autumn. As the train began to move, the landscape unfolded, a blur of wet fields and the occasional cluster of houses with roofs still dripping from the morning rain. Each passing scene felt like a line from an unfinished paragraph. Elias watched them drift by, knowing he would never learn their endings. The rhythm of the wheels echoed softly beneath him, steady and familiar. He thought of Beaumont's words, "The story ends only when you stop listening." It sounded less like a farewell now, and more like advice. Maybe the old man hadn't vanished at all. Maybe he had simply stepped into the pauses between sentences, the spaces that stories leave open for those who come after. Elias opened the notebook again. On the first page, the ink from the cafe had faded, but the words remained legible. "She sings truth." Below it he wrote, "And I carry it forward." He tapped the pen lightly against the paper, thinking of Clara, her laughter, her calm, her insistence that songs and stories were made of the same fabric, threads of silence woven through by courage. He wondered if she was singing that morning, her voice carrying through the empty cafe to whoever needed it most. Perhaps that was how stories lived on, not by being perfect, but by being repeated. The old woman across the aisle looked up from her knitting. "Writing letters?" she asked kindly. "Something like that," Elias said. "Good," she nodded. "The world forgets less when people write." He smiled, closing the notebook halfway. "Do you write?" "Used to," she said. "Now I tell stories to my granddaughter. The same ones over and over. She always pretends it's the first time. That's the best kind of listener," Elias said. The woman chuckled softly and returned to her work. The train continued its slow climb inland, past bridges and streams that glittered under the hesitant sun. As miles passed, Elias realized he hadn't felt lonely since leaving the coast. There was something new moving quietly within him. Not joy exactly, but peace's older cousin, acceptance. The kind that doesn't erase what came before, but folds it gently into memory. He took out Beaumont's note, one last time. "The river waits." Folding it between the last 2 pages of the notebook, he wrote underneath, "It waited long enough. I've arrived." For a while, he simply watched the scenery. Children waved from the edge of a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys. Laundry fluttered on balconies. Life continued in all directions, stubborn and beautiful. He thought of how many stories were happening at that exact moment, each unaware of the others, each deserving to be told. The train slowed near a station. The sign read Marceau, the same name as the street where Lissing Yuwa stood. A coincidence, perhaps, or a circle closing quietly upon itself. Elias smiled. He hadn't realized the line looped back to the city. He stepped off the train, boots striking wet pavement, and was greeted by the same scent of roasted coffee and rain that had followed him for weeks. The city hadn't changed. It rarely does. But his way of seeing it had. The lamplight seemed softer now, the cobblestones less tired. He walked through the familiar streets until the glow of the cafe appeared at the corner. The sign still flickered, still imperfect, still home. Through the window, he saw Clara arranging flowers in a small vase at the counter. She looked up, saw him, and smiled as if she'd expected him all along. Elias entered quietly. The bell above the door gave its soft chime. "Back already?" she asked. "I think I forgot to return something," he said, placing the notebook on the counter. Clara looked at it, but didn't open it. "Then you'd better keep it," she said. "That story's not done." He laughed softly. "You sound like Beaumont. Maybe he left a bit of himself in all of us," she said. The cafe was empty, the kind of calm that invites conversation. Outside, the drizzle had begun again, turning the street into a watercolor of reflections. Elias ordered coffee, and Clara poured it herself. "How was the sea?" she asked. "Vast," he said. "Quiet, honest." She nodded. "Sounds like you." They sat at the same corner table, the one where everything had begun. The jazz record on the player murmured faintly, an old melody that had survived scratches and skips, but still played true. Elias traced the rim of his cup. "You were right, you know. Stories don't fix things. They just teach us how to live with what's left." Clara smiled. "And sometimes that's enough." They spoke little after that. The cafe filled slowly with the day's first customers. A young couple sharing a pastry, a man reading the paper, the hum of ordinary life returning. Through it all, the rain kept time. Elias opened his notebook once more and wrote a final entry, his handwriting steadier than before. "If I ever forget the sound of this rain, may the next story remind me. If I ever lose the rhythm of hope, may the music of ordinary days bring it back. And if anyone finds these words long after I'm gone, let them know I was listening." He closed the notebook gently, the way one closes a letter meant for the future. Clara leaned over and whispered, "What did you write?" He smiled. "Just a promise to keep the music playing." She nodded, her eyes soft. Then the night's work is done. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, leaving behind air that smelled of renewal. Elias looked through the window at the street beyond. Wet stones, faint sunlight, life continuing. He didn't know where the next chapter would lead, but for the first time, he didn't need to. He lifted his cup, savoring the warmth, the sound of the record, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath their chairs. Everything was imperfect, and that made it real. And as the train's distant whistle echoed through the city once more, Elias smiled, certain that somewhere beyond the rain, another story was already beginning to write itself.